The bustling Chicago O'Hare International Airport serves as the backdrop for the opening scenes of this gripping narrative. The camera pans across the vast terminal, capturing the frenetic energy of travelers rushing to catch flights, families reuniting, and business people navigating the crowds with determined strides. Amidst this chaos, we focus on the exclusive VIP lounge, a haven of luxury and tranquility separated from the common areas. Inside the lounge, Stephen Carter, a well-known investment mogul, commands attention. His tailored suit and confident demeanor mark him as a man accustomed to power and influence. Stephen is engaged in an animated discussion with a group of fellow investors, their voices low but excited as they discuss potential deals and market trends. The other investors hang on Stephen's every word, clearly impressed by his knowledge and charisma. As the conversation flows, the camera subtly shifts to a corner of the lounge where a young girl sits alone. This is Nadia, a black teenager whose body language screams discomfort and fear. She's dressed in clothes that seem slightly too mature for her age, a detail that might raise eyebrows upon closer inspection. Nadia's eyes dart nervously around the room, always returning to Stephen, watching his every move with a mixture of dread and resignation. Stephen, mid-conversation, catches Nadia's eye and gestures for her to join the group. His smile never wavers, but there's an undercurrent of steel in his gaze that brooks no argument. Nadia hesitates, her reluctance palpable. She slowly rises from her seat, her movements stiff and uncertain as she approaches the group of adults. As Nadia draws closer, the contrast between her and the wealthy investors becomes stark. She stands out not just because of her youth, but also due to the tension evident in every line of her body. The investors barely acknowledge her presence, their focus remaining on Stephen and the potential profits being discussed. It's at this moment that Nadia, thinking no one is watching, makes a silent plea for help. Her hands, partially hidden by her side, form the universal signal for distress, a fist enclosed by the other hand. The movement is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it catches the eye of a nearby security guard who has been scanning the lounge. The guard, a seasoned professional trained to spot irregularities, notices the discrepancy between Stephen's relaxed demeanor and Nadia's obvious distress. He begins to approach the group, his movements casual but purposeful, not wanting to alert Stephen to his suspicions. As the guard draws nearer, Stephen's demeanor changes almost imperceptibly. His smile becomes slightly fixed, and a bead of sweat forms on his brow. He places a hand on Nadia's shoulder in a gesture that might appear fatherly to a casual observer. But the way Nadia flinches at his touch tells a different story. The security guard reaches the group and politely interrupts, asking to speak with Stephen privately. Stephen's smile never wavers as he excuses himself from the investors, but there's a new tension in his movements. As they step away, Stephen casts a warning glance at Nadia, who remains rooted to the spot, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. The scene ends with a close-up of Nadia's face as she watches Stephen being led away by the security guard. For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear crosses her features. A tiny spark of hope that perhaps her silent cry for help has finally been heard. This opening sequence sets the stage for the unfolding drama, introducing the key players and the central conflict. It establishes the power dynamic between Stephen and Nadia, hints at the darker undertones of their relationship, and introduces the element of hope in the form of the observant security guard. The contrast between the opulent setting and the sinister situation brewing beneath the surface creates a tension that will drive the narrative forward. The security guard, a man in his late 30s named Michael, leads Stephen away from the group of investors. His movements are deliberate and professional, giving no outward indication of his suspicions. Stephen follows, maintaining his composure but with a noticeable tightness around his eyes. "Mr. Carter, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a few questions," Michael says, his tone polite but firm. They stop at a quieter corner of the lounge, away from prying ears. Stephen's smile remains fixed as he responds, "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" Michael glances back at Nadia, who remains with the group of investors but looks visibly uncomfortable. "Sir, can you tell me about your relationship with the young lady over there?" A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps fear, crosses Stephen's face before his smooth facade returns. "Nadia, she's my goddaughter. I'm escorting her on a trip. Is there an issue?" Michael's training kicks in as he notes Stephen's micro-expressions and the slight tremor in his voice. "I see. And does Nadia have any identification with her?" Stephen's smile falters for a split second. "Of course. She's just a bit shy around strangers. Why don't I go get her documents for you?" As Stephen turns to walk back to Nadia, Michael places a hand on his arm. "Actually, Mr. Carter, I'd prefer to speak with Nadia directly if you don't mind." The tension in the air is palpable as Stephen hesitates, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nods, his voice tight. "Of course, whatever you need." Michael approaches Nadia, who shrinks back slightly as he nears. He crouches down to her eye level, his voice gentle. "Nadia, would you mind coming with me for a moment? We just need to verify a few things." Nadia's eyes dart to Stephen, who gives an almost imperceptible nod. She swallows hard and nods, following Michael to a small, private room off the main lounge area. Inside the room, Michael gestures for Nadia to take a seat. He notices her trembling hands and the way her eyes keep darting to the door. "Nadia, you're not in any trouble. I just want to make sure everything's okay. Can you tell me about your relationship with Mr. Carter?" Nadia remains silent for a long moment, her internal struggle visible on her face. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she says, "He's not my godfather." Michael nods encouragingly. "Can you tell me more about that?" Tears begin to form in Nadia's eyes as the dam finally breaks. "I ran away from home. My stepfather. He was hurting me. I met Stephen online. He said he could help me, give me a better life." As Nadia continues to speak, the full horror of her situation becomes clear. Stephen had manipulated her vulnerability, using his wealth and influence to gain her trust. He had promised her safety and opportunity, but instead had trapped her in a nightmare of exploitation and abuse. Michael listens intently, his face compassionate, but professional. When Nadia finishes speaking, he gently explains that he needs to involve the police and child protective services. Nadia's fear is evident, but there's also a glimmer of relief in her eyes. Outside the room, Stephen paces anxiously, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. When he sees the local police arrive, led by a detective, the reality of his situation finally sinks in. His shoulders slump as he realizes his web of lies and manipulation is about to unravel. The detective approaches Stephen, his expression grim. "Mr. Carter, we need you to come with us. We have some questions about your relationship with Nadia." As Stephen is led away in handcuffs, the other passengers in the lounge watch in shock. The contrast between his earlier confidence and his current defeated demeanor is stark. Meanwhile, a female officer sits with Nadia, offering comfort and explaining what will happen next. Nadia's fear is still evident, but there's also a newfound strength in her posture. For the first time in months, she feels a glimmer of hope. The scene ends with Nadia being gently escorted out of the lounge, flanked by protective officers. As they pass Stephen, who is being read his rights, their eyes meet. In that moment, the power dynamic shifts. Stephen looks away first, unable to meet the accusation in Nadia's gaze. This sequence of events marks a crucial turning point in the story. It transitions from the hidden abuse to the beginning of justice, setting the stage for the broader investigation and societal implications that will follow. The contrast between Stephen's fall from grace and Nadia's first steps towards freedom creates a powerful emotional resonance, driving home the themes of power, vulnerability, and the long road to recovery that will define the rest of the narrative. Detective Mark Thompson arrives at the Chicago Police Department, his weathered face a map of late nights and difficult cases. At 45, he's seen more than his share of humanity's darker side. but cases involving child exploitation always hit him the hardest. As he walks into the precinct, the buzz of activity intensifies. "Thompson, you're going to want to see this," his partner Sarah Chen calls out. She hands him a file, her eyes serious. "Remember that trafficking ring we've been trying to crack? I think we just got our break." Mark scans the preliminary report on Stephen Carter's arrest. His eyes narrow as he recognizes the name. "Carter? The investment guru?" Sarah nods grimly. "The one and only. Airport security caught him with a teenage girl. She's talking, Mark. Says he lured her away from an abusive home." Mark's jaw tightens. He's been chasing shadows for months, convinced that someone with means and influence was behind a string of disappearances. Now it seems they have a face to put to their suspicions. "What do we know about Carter?" Mark asks, already moving towards his desk. Sarah follows, rattling off information. "Stephen Carter, 52, self-made millionaire, major player in tech investments, sits on the board of half a dozen charities." She pauses, her voice lowering. "Including 2 focused on at-risk youth." The irony isn't lost on Mark. He's seen this before. Predators hiding behind a veneer of respectability, using their positions to access vulnerable victims. "Let's dig deeper. I want to know everything about Carter, his associates, his finances, his travel history." As they work, the scale of Carter's influence becomes apparent. His donations have funded political campaigns, endowed university chairs, and supported numerous civic projects. Mark realizes they're not just going after a lone predator. They're potentially unraveling a network that reaches into the highest echelons of Chicago society. Hours pass as they build their case. Mark's office becomes a war room, walls covered with photos, timelines, and connection maps. Each new piece of information paints a more disturbing picture. "Look at this," Sarah says, pointing to a financial record. "Large cash withdrawals, all just under the reporting threshold. And they coincide with trips to Southeast Asia." Mark nods grimly. Classic trafficking behavior. He's been hiding in plain sight, using his business trips as cover. As night falls, Mark finds himself staring at a photo of Carter, trying to reconcile the smiling philanthropist with the monster described in Nadia's statement. A knock at the door interrupts his thoughts. Captain Rodriguez enters, his face grave. "Thompson, a word?" In the captain's office, Mark braces himself. He knows what's coming. "You understand the sensitivity of this case, right?" Rodriguez begins. "Carter's got friends in high places. The mayor's office is already asking questions." Mark feels a familiar anger rising. "With all due respect, sir, I don't give a damn about Carter's friends. We've got a victim willing to testify and evidence of a larger operation. We can't back down now." Rodriguez sighs, rubbing his temples. "I'm not asking you to back down. I'm telling you to be careful. This could blow up in our faces if we're not airtight." As Mark leaves the office, his resolve hardens. He's been waiting for a case like this, a chance to expose the rot at the core of the system. But he also knows the risks. Powerful men like Carter don't go down easily, and they rarely go down alone. Back at his desk, Mark finds Sarah still working, her determination matching his own. "What did the captain say?" she asks. "The usual," Mark replies, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "Be careful, don't rock the boat too much." Sarah snorts. "Since when have you ever listened to that advice?" Mark allows himself a small smile. "Never, and I'm not about to start now." He picks up Carter's file again. "We're going to follow this wherever it leads. If Carter's part of a larger network, we're going to expose it, no matter who gets caught in the net." As they dive back into their investigation, Mark can't help but think of Nadia and all the other potential victims out there. He's always prided himself on his detachment, on not letting cases get to him personally. But this one's different. This time it's not just about solving a crime. It's about changing a system that allows predators like Carter to operate with impunity. The night wears on, but Mark and Sarah show no signs of slowing down. They know they're in for a long, difficult fight. But as the pieces start to come together, A grim satisfaction settles over them. They're on the right track, and for the first time in a long while, Mark feels like they might actually make a difference. As dawn breaks, Mark looks at the evidence board one last time before heading home for a few hours of sleep. He makes a silent promise to Nadia and all the other victims. Justice will be served, no matter the cost. The media frenzy erupts like a volcano, spewing headlines across Chicago and beyond. "Tech tycoon arrested in child exploitation case," screams the Chicago Tribune. Cable news channels run breathless updates, their chyrons a constant reminder of the scandal unfolding in the Windy City. In the eye of this media storm stands Nadia, her face pixelated on screens, but her story raw and unfiltered. Reporters clamor for exclusive interviews, each hoping to be the one to crack open the case that's gripping the nation. Sarah Chen, now the department's de facto press liaison, stands before a forest of microphones. "We can confirm that Stephen Carter has been arrested in connection with an ongoing investigation into child exploitation. We urge any other potential victims to come forward. Your voices will be heard, and your safety is our primary concern." As Sarah fields questions, Mark Thompson watches from the sidelines, his eyes scanning the crowd. He notices a woman in the back, her intense focus setting her apart from the jostling reporters. After the press conference, she approaches him. "Detective Thompson? I'm Elena Reyes from the Children's Rights Alliance," she says, extending her hand. "We'd like to offer our support to Nadia and any other victims who come forward." Mark studies her, weighing her sincerity against his ingrained suspicion. "Ms. Reyes, I appreciate the offer, but we need to ensure Nadia's privacy and safety." Elena nods understandingly. "Of course, we're not here to exploit her story. We want to provide resources, legal support, counseling, whatever she needs to heal and reclaim her life." After a long moment, Mark nods. "Let me talk to Nadia. If she's open to it, I'll put you in touch with her guardian ad litem." As the days pass, Nadia's story becomes a rallying cry. The Children's Rights Alliance launches a campaign, "Hear Our Voices," featuring silhouettes of children with Nadia's words superimposed. "I was silent. Now I speak for those who can't." Elena and her team work tirelessly, coordinating with law enforcement and social services. They set up a hotline for other potential victims, arrange for trauma-informed therapists, and begin the delicate process of helping Nadia heal. In a small, comfortable room at the CRA office, Nadia sits with Dr. Amelia Foster, a child psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. "Nadia, I want you to know that everything we discuss here is confidential," Dr. Foster begins, her voice gentle but firm. "This is a safe space for you to express anything you're feeling." Nadia nods, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. I don't know where to start," she admits, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's okay," Dr. Foster reassures her. "We can start wherever you're comfortable. Maybe you could tell me about how you're feeling right now." As Nadia begins to open up, the full weight of her trauma becomes clear. The abuse at home, the false promises of safety and opportunity, the manipulation and exploitation, it all comes pouring out in a torrent of words and tears. Dr. Foster listens attentively, offering support and validation. "Nadia, what you've been through is not your fault. You showed incredible bravery in speaking up." Meanwhile, Mark and Sarah continue their investigation, following leads that take them into the darkest corners of Chicago's elite society. They uncover a web of connections linking Carter to other powerful figures, politicians, business leaders, even a judge. As they piece together the network, Mark receives a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end is distorted. "Detective Thompson, be careful where you step. Some doors are better left closed." Mark's grip tightens on the phone. "Is that a threat?" "Consider it a friendly warning," the voice replies before the line goes dead. Sarah looks at Mark, concern etched on her face. "What was that about?" Mark's jaw sets in determination. Looks like we're on the right track. Someone's getting nervous. Back at the CRA, Elena briefs her team on the latest developments. We're making progress, but there's still so much to do. We need to ensure Nadia and the other victims have ongoing support, not just during the investigation, but through the trial and beyond. As she speaks, a news alert pops up on her phone. Another arrest has been made, a city councilman linked to Carter's network. The case is growing, its tendrils reaching further than anyone initially imagined. Elena looks out the window at the Chicago skyline, her reflection overlaid on the glittering buildings. She thinks about Nadia and all the other children still out there, silent and suffering. We're just getting started, she murmurs to herself. The sun sets over Chicago, casting long shadows across the city. In a safe house on the outskirts of town, Nadia stands at a similar window, Dr. Foster by her side. For the first time in months, Nadia allows herself to think about the future, not with fear, but with a tentative hope. Do you think it'll ever be over? Nadia asks softly. Doctor. Foster places a gentle hand on her shoulder. Healing takes time, Nadia. But you've taken the first step and you're not alone. We're here with you, every step of the way. As night falls, the city seems to hold its breath, waiting for the next revelation in a case that's shaking it to its core. The press conference room at the Chicago Police Department is packed to capacity. Cameras flash and reporters murmur as Nadia takes her place at the podium, flanked by Detective Mark Thompson and Elena Reyes from the Children's Rights Alliance. The room falls silent as Nadia begins to speak, her voice quiet but steady. My name is Nadia Williams. For months I was trapped in a nightmare, manipulated and exploited by people I thought I could trust. Today I'm here to tell my story, not just for myself, but for all the children who are still suffering in silence. As Nadia recounts her ordeal, leaving out the most graphic details but painting a clear picture of the abuse she endured, the room remains hushed. Hardened reporters blink back tears, and cameramen shift uncomfortably behind their equipment. I'm not ashamed anymore, Nadia continues, her voice growing stronger. I'm angry. Angry at the people who hurt me, angry at the system that failed to protect me. But I'm also hopeful. Hopeful that by speaking out, I can help other victims find their voice. The impact of Nadia's words is immediate and far-reaching. As soon as the press conference ends, the police hotline is flooded with calls. Some are from other victims, emboldened by Nadia's courage to come forward. Others are from concerned citizens offering tips and information. In the days that follow, Mark Thompson finds himself working around the clock. He's reviewing an old case file, a missing persons report from 2 years ago when Sarah Chen bursts into his office. Mark, you need to see this, she says, dropping a stack of papers on his desk. Remember that judge we were looking into, the one with connections to Carter? His name keeps coming up in these old cases. Too many times to be a coincidence. Mark's eyes narrow as he scans the documents. Good work, Sarah. This could be the link we've been looking for. Let's dig deeper. As they delve into the old cases, a pattern begins to emerge. Children from troubled homes, runaways, kids in the foster system, all disappearing, with investigations that seem to hit dead ends suspiciously quickly. It's like they were being erased, Sarah mutters, staring at the wall of photos and notes they've assembled. Mark nods grimly. And now we know why. They had someone on the inside making sure these cases never saw the light of day. Their breakthrough comes late one night. An old police report buried deep in the archives mentions a property owned by a shell company. The address matches a location that came up in Carter's financial records. This is it, Mark says, his excitement palpable. This could be where they were keeping the kids. As they prepare to raid the property, Mark receives another anonymous call. The same distorted voice warns him, "You're poking a hornet's nest, detective. Back off now, or you won't like what comes next." Mark's response is curt. "Thanks for the concern, but I'll take my chances." He hangs up and turns to Sarah. Looks like we're over the target. They're getting desperate. The raid on the property yields a treasure trove of evidence. Computer hard drives, financial records, and most disturbingly, photos and videos of numerous children, many of whom had been reported missing over the years. As the evidence is catalogued and analyzed, the true scope of the trafficking ring becomes clear. It's not just Chicago. There are connections to similar operations in other major cities across the country. Back at the station, Mark stares at the evidence board, his mind racing. They're no longer just dealing with a local predator. They've stumbled onto an interstate trafficking operation with tentacles reaching into law enforcement, the judiciary, and politics. Elena from the CRA visits the station, her face grave. "Detective, we're getting more calls than we can handle. These kids, they need protection, counseling, support. We're stretched to the limit." Mark nods understandingly. "We're doing everything we can to shut this down, Elena. But I need you to keep those kids safe. They're not just victims, they're our key witnesses." As they talk, a commotion erupts in the bullpen. Sarah rushes in, her eyes wide. "Mark, you're not going to believe this. We just got a call from the FBI. They want in on the case." Mark's expression is a mix of relief and wariness. On one hand, federal resources could be a game changer. On the other, he's all too aware of how easily information can be buried when it reaches certain levels. "All right," he says finally. "Tell them we'll cooperate fully, but this remains our investigation. We're not handing it off." As night falls over Chicago, Mark stands at his office window, looking out at the city lights. He thinks about Nadia, about all the other victims they've identified, and about the countless others still out there. The case has become more than just an investigation. It's a mission. "We're coming for you," he murmurs, his reflection resolute in the glass. "No matter how long it takes, no matter how high up it goes, we're going to bring this whole damn thing down." In a dimly lit private room of an upscale Chicago restaurant, Stephen Carter sits with a group of men, their expensive suits and worried expressions a stark contrast to the ambient luxury. The air is thick with tension and cigar smoke. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," Carter says, his usual smooth confidence replaced by barely concealed panic. "The police are digging deeper than we anticipated. We need to contain this situation before it spirals out of control." A silver-haired man, Judge William Hawthorne, leans forward. "My sources in the department say they've linked the old cases to our operation. It's only a matter of time before they connect all the dots. Then we need to make sure those dots never connect," says another man, City Councilman Robert Green. "Carter, your girl is the linchpin. If we can discredit her testimony, the whole case falls apart." Carter nods, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I've already set things in motion. We'll paint her as a troubled runaway with a history of false accusations. It's her word against ours, and we all know whose word carries more weight in this town." As the men continue to plot, unaware they're being watched, the scene shifts to a small, nondescript office across town. Nadia sits with other survivors, their faces a mix of determination and fear as they share their stories with each other. "I was so scared to come forward," a young boy named Tyler says, his voice barely above a whisper. "But when I saw Nadia on TV, I knew I had to speak up. I couldn't let them keep hurting other kids." Nadia reaches out and squeezes Tyler's hand. "You're brave, Tyler. We all are. By standing together, we're stronger than they are." Elena Reyes watches the interaction with a mixture of pride and concern. The support group has been a crucial part of the healing process for the survivors, but she knows the road ahead is still long and difficult. "Nadia," Elena says gently, pulling her aside. "Detective Thompson called. They want you to review some photos, see if you can identify any other victims or locations. Are you up for that?" Nadia's face pales slightly, but she nods. "If it helps bring them down, I'll do whatever it takes." Meanwhile, across the city, Mark Thompson is burning the midnight oil, poring over financial records and property deeds. Sarah Chen enters carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Any luck?" she asks, setting a cup on his desk. Mark rubs his tired eyes. Maybe. Look at this. He points to a series of transactions. Large sums of money being moved through a series of shell companies, all leading back to a holding company owned by Judge Hawthorne. Sarah's eyes widen. The same judge who's been dismissing cases against Carter and his associates? Mark nods grimly. The very same. We've got him, Sarah. This is the link we've been looking for. As they discuss their next move, Mark's phone buzzes with a text from an unknown number. Back off now or the girl gets it. This is your final warning. Mark's jaw clenches as he shows the message to Sarah. They're getting desperate. We need to move fast. Back at the support group, Nadia is preparing to leave when Elena receives an urgent call. Her face grows serious as she listens. Nadia, she says after hanging up, we need to move you to a new safe house right now. Panic flashes across Nadia's face. What's wrong? Did something happen? Elena tries to keep her voice calm. It's just a precaution. Detective Thompson thinks the people who hurt you might be planning something. We need to make sure you're safe. As they quickly gather Nadia's things, the other survivors watch with concern. Tyler steps forward. We're with you, Nadia, all of us. They can't silence us anymore. Nadia manages a small smile, drawing strength from the support of her peers. As they leave the building, she notices a black car parked across the street, its windows tinted. She shivers, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Elena guides her to a waiting police car. It's going to be okay, Nadia. We're not going to let anything happen to you. As the car pulls away, Nadia looks back at the group of survivors watching from the doorway. In that moment, she realizes that her fight is no longer just about her own justice. It's about all of them, and countless others still suffering in silence. The car disappears into the night, carrying Nadia to an uncertain future. But for the first time since this ordeal began, she feels a sense of purpose stronger than her fear. Whatever comes next, she knows she's not facing it alone. The Cook County Courthouse stands imposing against the gray Chicago sky. Its neoclassical columns are stark contrast to the modern buildings surrounding it. Today, its steps are crowded with reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers, all waiting for the trial that has captured the nation's attention to begin. Inside the courtroom is a pressure cooker of tension. On one side sits Stephen Carter, his once impeccable appearance now slightly disheveled, his confident smirk replaced by a look of barely concealed worry. His high-powered legal team surrounds him, whispering last-minute strategies. On the other side, Nadia sits with Elena Reyes and the prosecution team. She's dressed simply but neatly, her face a mask of determination. Detective Mark Thompson and Sarah Chen sit just behind her, their presence a silent show of support. As the bailiff calls the court to order, Judge Maria Sandoval enters. She's a no-nonsense jurist, specially brought in from out of state to ensure impartiality given the high-profile nature of the case and the allegations of judicial corruption. All rise, the bailiff announces, and the room falls silent. Judge Sandoval surveys the courtroom, her gaze sharp. Be seated. We're here today in the case of the People versus Stephen Carter. Are both sides ready to proceed? The lead prosecutor, Alexandra Winters, stands. The People are ready, Your Honor. Carter's lead attorney, the notorious defense lawyer Jackson Reed, rises next. The defense is ready, Your Honor. Judge Sandoval nods. Very well. Ms. Winters, you may give your opening statement. Alexandra moves to stand before the jury, her voice clear and passionate as she outlines the case against Carter. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about power, manipulation, and the exploitation of the most vulnerable members of our society. The evidence will show that Stephen Carter, a man of wealth and influence, used his resources not to help those in need, but to prey upon them. As Alexandra continues detailing the charges and the evidence they'll present, Nadia listens intently. She can feel the eyes of the jurors on her, and she forces herself to meet their gazes, silently willing them to believe. to understand. When it's the defense's turn, Jackson Reed approaches the jury with the smooth confidence of a man used to swaying opinions. "Members of the jury, the prosecution would have you believe a fantastical tale of conspiracy and exploitation, but the truth is far simpler. This case is built on the word of troubled young people, led by a girl with a history of running away and making false accusations." Nadia feels her heart rate spike as Reed speaks, his words cutting deep. Elena places a comforting hand on her arm, grounding her. As the opening statements conclude, Judge Sandoval addresses the courtroom. "We'll now hear from our first witness. The prosecution may call its first witness." Alexandra stands. The people call Nadia Williams to the stand. A hush falls over the courtroom as Nadia makes her way to the witness stand. She's rehearsed this moment countless times with the prosecutors and her therapist, but nothing could fully prepare her for the reality of facing her abuser in court. As she's sworn in, Nadia's eyes briefly meet Carter's. His expression is unreadable, but she feels a chill run down her spine. She takes a deep breath, reminding herself of the strength she's found, of all the people supporting her. Alexandra approaches, her voice gentle but firm. "Nadia, can you please tell the court how you first met the defendant, Stephen Carter?" Nadia's voice is quiet but steady as she begins her testimony. "I was in a bad situation at home. My stepfather, he was abusive. I felt trapped, desperate. I started looking online for ways to escape, for anyone who could help me. That's when I met Stephen. He seemed kind, understanding. He promised me safety, a chance at a better life." As Nadia continues her testimony, recounting the manipulation, the exploitation, the fear, the courtroom listens in stunned silence. Even some of the hardened reporters in the gallery find themselves blinking back tears. Carter's face remains impassive, but his attorneys shift uncomfortably in their seats. They know that Nadia's powerful testimony could be devastating to their case. When Alexandra finishes her questioning, Jackson Reed stands for cross-examination. His approach is aggressive from the start. "Ms. Williams, isn't it true that you have a history of running away from home, of making false accusations against authority figures?" Before Nadia can answer, Alexandra is on her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is attempting to victim blame and introduce prejudicial information." Judge Sandoval's voice is sharp. "Sustained. Mr. Reed, you will stick to questions relevant to this case." Reed nods, but his tactics remain clear: to discredit Nadia, to paint her as an unreliable witness. As the cross-examination continues, Nadia feels her resolve being tested. But each time she falters, she remembers the other survivors, the ones who haven't yet found their voice. She draws strength from their silent support. As the first day of the trial comes to a close, the air in the courtroom is thick with emotion and tension. This is just the beginning of what promises to be a long and grueling legal battle. But for Nadia, for the other survivors, and for all those working to bring this case to justice, it's a crucial first step towards breaking the silence and exposing the truth. As the trial progresses, the prosecution builds its case methodically, presenting a mountain of evidence that paints a damning picture of Stephen Carter and his network. Financial records, surveillance footage, and testimonies from other victims and witnesses all point to a vast, well-organized operation of child exploitation. Today, the courtroom is packed as Detective Mark Thompson takes the stand. He cuts an imposing figure, his years of experience evident in his confident demeanor. Alexandra Winters, the lead prosecutor, approaches him. "Detective Thompson, can you please tell the court about the evidence you uncovered during your investigation of the defendant, Stephen Carter?" Mark leans slightly towards the microphone. "During our investigation, we discovered a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts used to funnel money from illegal activities. These financial trails led us to several properties owned by Mr. Carter and his associates, properties that were used to house and exploit minors." As Mark continues his testimony, he presents a series of documents and photographs. Each piece of evidence seems to tighten the noose around Carter's neck. The jury listens attentively, their expressions a mix of horror and disgust at the details being revealed. When it's time for cross-examination, Jackson Reed approaches the stand, his demeanor aggressive. "Detective Thompson, isn't it true that much of your evidence is circumstantial? That you've made assumptions based on financial records that could have perfectly legitimate explanations?" Mark remains unflappable. While some evidence is circumstantial, when taken as a whole, it paints a clear picture of Mr. Carter's activities. Furthermore, we have corroborating testimony from multiple victims and witnesses. Reed presses on, trying to find holes in the investigation, but Mark's responses remain steady and assured. His years of experience shine through as he calmly rebuts each of Reed's attempts to discredit the evidence. As the days pass, more witnesses take the stand. Social workers testify about the trauma endured by the victims. Financial experts break down the money trails that funded the operation. Former employees of Carter's companies speak about suspicious activities they observed. Each testimony adds another piece to the puzzle, revealing the true extent of the network's reach. The courtroom watches as the web of corruption is slowly untangled, implicating not just Carter but several other prominent figures in Chicago's elite circles. One particularly powerful moment comes when Tyler, the young boy from the support group, takes the stand. His voice shakes as he recounts his ordeal, but his eyes remain fixed on Nadia, drawing strength from her presence. "I was scared all the time," Tyler testifies. "They told me no one would believe me if I tried to tell, but then I saw Nadia on TV speaking out. That's when I knew I had to be brave too." In the gallery, Nadia feels a mix of pride and sorrow. Pride in Tyler's courage, sorrow for what he and so many others have endured. She notices several jurors wiping away tears as Tyler speaks. As the prosecution's case nears its end, the defense team appears increasingly desperate. Their attempts to discredit witnesses often backfire, serving only to highlight the strength and consistency of the victims' testimonies. On the final day of the prosecution's case, Alexandra Winters calls an unexpected witness, Judge William Hawthorne. A murmur runs through the courtroom as the disgraced judge takes the stand, his once imperious demeanor now subdued. "Judge Hawthorne," Alexandra begins, "can you please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant, Stephen Carter?" Hawthorne's voice is barely audible as he responds, I was part of it. Carter approached me years ago, offered me money to dismiss certain cases, to look the other way. I knew it was wrong, but the money, it was so much." As Hawthorne continues his testimony, detailing years of judicial corruption and cover-ups, the full scope of the conspiracy is finally laid bare. Carter's face, usually impassive, shows a flicker of fear for the first time. In the gallery, Mark and Sarah exchange a look of grim satisfaction. This is what they've been working towards, the breakthrough that could bring down not just Carter, but the entire corrupt system that enabled him. As the day's session comes to a close, Judge Sandoval addresses the court. "We'll adjourn for today. The defense will begin presenting its case tomorrow morning." As the courtroom empties, Nadia remains seated, processing all she's heard. Elena sits beside her, offering silent support. "You okay?" Elena asks softly. Nadia nods slowly. "I think so. It's just, hearing it all laid out like that, it's overwhelming." Elena squeezes her hand. "You've been so strong, Nadia. Your courage made all of this possible." As they leave the courthouse, they're met by a crowd of supporters holding signs with messages of encouragement. Nadia pauses, looking out at the sea of faces. For the first time, she truly understands the impact of her decision to speak out. It's no longer just about her story. It's about changing the system, about giving voice to the voiceless. With renewed determination, Nadia faces the cameras, ready to share her message of hope and resilience with the world. The defense's case begins with a desperate attempt to salvage Stephen Carter's reputation. Jackson Reed, in his opening statement, paints a picture of Carter as a misunderstood philanthropist, a victim of circumstances and false accusations. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Reed begins, his voice smooth and persuasive. "You've heard a lot of sensational claims over the past few days, but what you haven't heard is the truth about Stephen Carter, a man who has dedicated his life to helping troubled youth, only to find himself the target of a witch hunt." As the defense presents its case, they call character witnesses, business associates, charity directors, and even a few former success stories from Carter's youth programs. Each testifies to Carter's generosity and positive influence, carefully sidestepping any mention of the charges against him. However, under cross-examination by Alexandra Winters, cracks begin to appear in their testimonies. Many are forced to admit they had limited knowledge of Carter's personal life or the full scope of his charitable activities. The turning point comes when the defense calls Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a psychologist they've hired to discredit Nadia and the other victims. As she takes the stand, Nadia tenses, knowing what's coming. "Dr. Marsh," Reed begins, "in your expert opinion, how reliable are the testimonies of traumatized individuals, particularly young people with troubled backgrounds?" Dr. Marsh leans into the microphone. "It's well documented that trauma can affect memory and perception. In cases involving individuals with a history of family issues or runaway behavior, there's often a tendency to misinterpret or exaggerate events." As Reed continues to lead Dr. Marsh through testimony designed to cast doubt on the victims' stories, Alexandra Winters prepares for cross-examination. When it's her turn, she approaches the stand with a stack of papers. "Dr. Marsh, are you familiar with the latest research on trauma and memory in abuse survivors?" Alexandra asks. Dr. Marsh hesitates. "I've reviewed the relevant literature, yes." Alexandra hands her a paper. "Could you please read the highlighted portion of this study from last year?" As Dr. Marsh reads aloud about the consistency and reliability of trauma memories in abuse survivors, her earlier testimony begins to unravel. By the time Alexandra finishes her cross-examination, Dr. Marsh's credibility has been severely damaged. Throughout the defense's case, Mark Thompson sits in the gallery, his frustration growing. He leans over to Sarah Chen, whispering, "They're trying to muddy the waters, make everything seem uncertain, but the evidence is solid. We just need the jury to see through this smoke screen." Sarah nods, her eyes never leaving the proceedings. "They will. The truth is too strong to ignore." As the trial nears its end, tension in the courtroom reaches a fever pitch. The defense, in a last-ditch effort, calls Stephen Carter himself to the stand. A hush falls over the room as he's sworn in. Carter, his usual polished demeanor somewhat diminished by weeks in custody, still manages to project an air of wounded innocence. Under questioning from Reed, he vehemently denies all charges, presenting himself as a caring mentor whose actions were misunderstood. "I only ever wanted to help these kids," Carter insists, his voice cracking with apparent emotion. "I gave them opportunities, a chance at a better life. I never, ever abused or exploited anyone." As Carter speaks, Nadia finds herself gripping Elena's hand tightly, fighting the urge to shout out against his lies. Elena squeezes back, a silent reminder to stay strong. When it's time for cross-examination, Alexandra Winters approaches the stand, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Mr. Carter, you claim you were helping these children. Can you explain these bank transfers to offshore accounts in their names?" What follows is a masterclass in legal interrogation. Alexandra methodically dismantles Carter's story, using his own records and the mountain of evidence gathered by Mark and Sarah to expose the truth behind his charitable work. By the time she's finished, Carter's composure has crumbled entirely. His responses become defensive, even hostile, a far cry from the benevolent figure he tried to portray earlier. As Carter steps down from the stand, the mood in the courtroom has shifted palpably. The jury's faces show a mix of disgust and resolve. Even some of Carter's most ardent supporters in the gallery look shaken. With both sides having presented their cases, Judge Sandoval addresses the court. "We'll hear closing arguments tomorrow, after which the case will go to the jury for deliberation." As the courtroom empties, Mark approaches Nadia and Elena. "You did great," he tells Nadia. "Just one more day. Are you ready?" Nadia takes a deep breath, looking from Mark to Elena, then over at the other survivors who've been attending the trial. "I'm ready," she says, her voice steady. "Whatever happens, we've told the truth. That's what matters." As they leave the courthouse, the weight of tomorrow's decision hangs heavy in the air. The fate of Stephen Carter, and potentially the entire network he represents, now rests in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens. For Nadia and the other survivors, the long wait for justice is almost over. The courtroom is packed to capacity on the day of closing arguments. The air is thick with tension as both sides prepare to make their final appeals to the jury. Alexandra Winters rises first, her posture confident as she addresses the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past weeks you've heard overwhelming evidence of Mr. Carter's crimes. You've heard from brave survivors who, despite their fear, chose to speak truth to power. You've seen financial records that reveal a vast network of exploitation. The defense would have you believe this is all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Carter is a misunderstood philanthropist. But the facts tell a different story." She methodically recaps the key points of evidence, weaving together a narrative that leaves little room for doubt. Mr. Carter didn't help these children. He preyed on them. He used his wealth and influence not to lift them up, but to trap them in a cycle of abuse and exploitation. Today you have the power to end that cycle, to tell Mr. Carter and others like him that they cannot hide behind their money and connections, that in this court, justice is blind to wealth and status. As Alexandra concludes, there's a palpable shift in the courtroom. Even some of the most stoic jurors seem moved by her words. Jackson Reed then stands for the defense's closing argument. His earlier confidence has faded, replaced by a desperate energy. "Members of the jury, the prosecution has painted a grim picture, but I urge you to look beyond the emotion, beyond the sensationalism. What do we really have here? Circumstantial evidence, the words of troubled youth. My client, Mr. Carter, has dedicated his life to helping underprivileged children. Are we to punish him for his generosity?" Reed's arguments, once smooth and persuasive, now ring hollow in the face of the mountain of evidence presented. As he concludes, it's clear that even he doesn't fully believe his own words. Judge Sandoval then instructs the jury on the law and sends them to deliberate. The wait begins. Hours pass, then days. The courthouse becomes a media circus with reporters camped out day and night, speculating on the verdict. Inside, Nadia and the other survivors wait anxiously, supported by Elena and the team from the Children's Rights Alliance. On the third day of deliberations, word comes that the jury has reached a verdict. As everyone files back into the courtroom, the tension is palpable. Judge Sandoval addresses the defendant. "Mr. Carter, please rise." Carter stands, his face a mask of forced calm. The jury foreman hands the verdict to the bailiff, who passes it to the judge. Judge Sandoval reads it silently, her expression giving nothing away. "Members of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreman stands. "We have, Your Honor." "On the count of human trafficking, how do you find?" "We find the defendant, Stephen Carter, guilty." A gasp ripples through the courtroom. Nadia feels Elena's hand tighten around hers. The foreman continues, reading out guilty verdicts on charges of sexual exploitation of minors, money laundering, and racketeering. With each guilty, Carter seems to shrink, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. As the final verdict is read, Nadia lets out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Tears stream down her face, not of sadness but of relief, of vindication. Judge Sandoval addresses Carter. "Stephen Carter, you have been found guilty of heinous crimes against the most vulnerable members of our society. You used your wealth and influence not to help, as you claimed, but to exploit and abuse. The court will reconvene in 2 weeks for sentencing." As Carter is led away in handcuffs, the courtroom erupts in a mix of cheers and sobs. Nadia finds herself enveloped in a group hug with other survivors, all of them crying and laughing at once. Outside the courthouse, Nadia faces a sea of cameras. With Elena by her side, she steps up to the microphones. Her voice, once timid, now rings out clear and strong. Today, justice was served, not just for me, but for all the survivors. To anyone out there who's suffering in silence, your voice matters, your truth matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As Nadia speaks, her words are broadcast across the nation. In living rooms and offices, people stop to listen. Her story, her courage, touches something deep in the public consciousness. In the days that follow, the impact of the verdict ripples outward. Investigations are launched into other suspected trafficking networks. Legislation is proposed to strengthen protection for vulnerable youth. The public conversation around exploitation and abuse shifts, with survivors' voices at the forefront. For Nadia, the journey isn't over. There's still healing to be done, still work to do. But as she looks out at the crowd of supporters, at the faces of other survivors now standing tall, she feels something she hasn't felt in a long time. Hope. The final scene shows Nadia speaking at a conference, her words inspiring a new generation of advocates. On the wall behind her, a mural depicts her face alongside the words that have become her rallying cry. Speak your truth. Change the world. As the camera pans out, we see that the audience is filled with people of all ages, all listening intently, all ready to take up the cause. The message is clear. One voice can start a movement, and that movement can change everything.